director of Junction, and Junction is the place you see here, which is the public venue of our service station. So we have events, all kind of events about the big variety of topics, from economics to health, environment, as well as today about civil society. This is a very important topic, not only for Thailand, but for the entire region. And already 2 years ago, we actually started a series of events about the shrinking space for civil society in Southeast Asia, from a funding perspective as well as from a legislation perspective. And today, we are going to talk about what is happening in Thailand at the moment, where there are 2 acts that are being discussed and almost approved. So it is very important to have a discussion about the detail, as this law will affect all non-profit organizations, including foundations like ourselves. So I give the words first to Sanam Lord from the ICJ, and then Phil Robinson from Human Rights Watch will discuss the detail, and we will conclude with Emily Kalani from Anisha Foundation that will tell us what would be a good legislation to create an enabling environment for NGOs. So it's meant to be a constructive discussion, not only about the risk of the new legislation, but also what can be done better, as there is still some space for discussion. So please. Yes.
Huh?
No. It's Anna.
You พูดไปก่อนทาง moderator ตัดสินใจแล้ว
So good evening, everyone. My name is Kay Sanwansi. So I'm from the International Commission of Jurists, or the ICJ. So let's start with this law. Indeed, we found out about this law in February, early February. First, we haven't heard about it at all. Indeed, we heard about some initiative from CSO in Thailand to find a venue somewhere to have a law that help them in terms of promote the work of CSO, promote the governance, and to let the CSO have more channel to work with the government. This kind of things we have heard about that before, but this just come out of blue. I mean, in early February, it was in mid-February that there was a news about the cabinet going to consider a draft law on the operations of the NGOs, and then on 23rd February, we saw the cabinet resolutions about this. So indeed, it was quite a shock, because it was just something that we haven't heard. I mean, Phil might talk a little bit about that. We heard about it many years ago, but it's not something we heard in the last 2 years. Then when this was introduced, when the first cabinet resolution was on 23rd February, and then just in 12 March, just 2 weeks after that, the actual draft act came out for cabinet resolutions. I'm not so sorry, for the public consultations. This is fast, pretty fast, and it's weird in Thailand for you to have a draft law this fast. And the cabinet resolution was from 12 March to 31st March, it just ended. And indeed, to have 2 weeks of, cabinet resolution, to have a 2 week of public consultation is very short here. Normally you have 2, 3, 4 weeks for public consultation, and many times the public consultation is something that they try to organize in person. Like you can physically join the event, listen about it, and then comment about the law. But this time, everything was just on internet, online, and it's on the web of the office of the Council of State. And then it's not a very popular places that you just go and comment on the draft act. So we were lucky that someone told us about this act and we distributed allow for everyone to comment. To make it very fast, why we are very worried about this draft law. The first thing is that this draft law is very designed to control the operations of civil society organizations. If you check out in Thai law, there will be a rationale and reasons for enacting the law on the first page. They will explain about why they have to enact this law. And if they, indeed, in that part, if you read it contains a lot of discriminatory language against the NGO that was funded by foreign sources. They kind of talk about now there are many NGOs funded by foreign sources and use it to conduct activity that might affect the relationship between Thailand and neighboring countries or affected the public order of Thailand. So that you may imagine that it starts with that. That's their starting point. Then they draft all the provisions in this law to reflect that. I think it's there's an understanding about how the CSO work in Thailand. Then it comes around a very four problematic issues in this draft law. The first very problematic issue is that all the terms in this draft law are very broad. The most problematic one is the term of NGO itself. In the draft law, it uses the term NPO, non-for-profit organization, but let me call it NGO. It basically says all the group of people, if you come together to do activities, if it's not for profit, then you'll be considered NPO. So you'll be NGO if you come together, like if you are a group of farmers who come together, do activities together, not for profit, you'll be NGO. Then what would come after this is you have to register. Otherwise, you'll be subject to criminal punishment, and this could be up to 5 years imprisonment if you're not registered and if you do activities. So that's quite a very shocking part of it. And we foresee that if it's the way it is right now, the draft act, then it is likely that if you, a group now, we have a lot of group of teenagers who come together do art exhibition, for example, it's not for profits. They come together and talk about some public issues, you know. This group of teenagers, they could be considered as NPO or NGOs. And of course, they're not registered because normally you feel like you are just an informal gatherings, you know, you're just an informal associations. And then there will be a channel for the authority to bring a claim abroad, to bring a claim and sue them, you know, for this kind of illegal gathering laws now in Thailand, but they just have another more tools, you know, to sue this group. So that one main concern is these very broad terms. Another thing that is not very clear, a very overbroad language in this draft act is about the registration requirement itself. When if you are NPO, NGO, then you must register. But you don't know yet, right now, we don't know yet what would be the registration condition or requirements. Because it say that the Minister of Interior will be the one who write it. So wait and see. It's basically how they say. This is quite worrying because you put all the power to a person to decide on these procedures, and you're not have a chance during this public consultation to comment on this kind of process. So I think that's one of very unclear part about this, and we think that it could be that in the future the registrations process will be more difficult, especially for NGO CSO who is quite a critic to the government, who talk about some topic that the government might not be very favor. The second problem was about we call it the paranoia foreign funding of this draft act. So in one section of the draft act, it says that, okay, if you are an NPO, NGO, then you have to register. But even if you are a registered NGO, if you got the funding from other countries, you are allowed to use it only for activities that which will later be allowed by the Minister of Interior. So basically now, you can't just use your funding for any activities, but you don't know yet what kind of activity which will be allowed. We don't know yet. So it might be like in Cambodia that you have to go to local authorities and ask for permissions in the future before you do activities. Or it can be something that in some other countries that you do activity, but one day authority will knock at your door and say, no, we think that your activity can be interpreted as causing impact to national security, for example. Then you can't use it. Otherwise, you have to, you will have your registration revoked. And it's really, indeed it wrote in the law that if you do activities that you're not around, then your registration will be revoked. And if you still do more activities after your registration revoked, then you go to jail. There's one clause that talk about the punishment of everything, it's like 5 year imprisonment or fine of 100,000 baht or more. The third concern is indeed about that jail sentence. I mean, 5 years no joke for Thai law, and indeed 100,000 baht fine is no joke as well in Thai law. You won't see it normally. If you just open our penal code, it could be just 500 baht if you hit someone. So indeed 100,000 baht is indeed, well, it's disproportionate of course from international law perspective, and indeed compared to other Thai law, it's quite disproportionate. I mean, for the fact that you're just like unregistered association and doing some activities. The fourth concerns that we have is they give a very broad, I would say, sweeping power to the authorities to go into the office of NGO and CSO to check everything in that office to see whether we do the activities that are not allowed or not. And they also have the power to copy the database, electronic data in that NGO for further investigation. So it's basically they can enter without search warrant. They can copy of everything in your office, make a copy of everything in your office, including your database, without search warrant as well, for further investigation. I mean, of course, they can probably investigate this and further press a charge against someone and saying like you do activity as an NGO without permission. But they might find some other thing as well. In those databases and in Thailand, as you can imagine, it could be violation of some other law in the criminal code as well. There's so many other popular laws that can always be used, with a lot of information in your hand. So that's another concern. Just to end a little bit with the appeal process. Under Thai law, normally, if they tell you that, oh, you are not, if the authority make any decision, normally you can appeal with that ministry or office again. Otherwise, you can go to the administrative court. That's a normal process. Under this law, it didn't write about appeal process, but if we assume, like in other cases in Thailand, that you can go to administrative court to challenge the decision, you can appeal through this. That sounds fine. The problem is that there's a section in the law that says during this appeal process, revocation of license may revoke. You can't do anything during this appeal process. And Thai court can take years to reach a conclusion. It's not just one step, it's just like 2 or 3 levels of the court that you can go in Thailand. So that meant that in the 2 or 3 years, you can't do anything or do any activities under this law. So that's the key concerns that we had. Indeed, I didn't talk about some other extra requirement for NGO, like to disclose financial report, to disclose a list of activities every year that we have to report to the authorities, have to do an audit account or something like that. I mean, well, that's caused some burdens to the NGO, but I mean, but that's one thing that I understand that most of the company and now many foundations is also doing that account, audit account. that's cost burden, but still more acceptable, like than other provisions I was talking about. So I just start with this, then probably could fail maybe the second solution.
Thank you very much. That was a great summary of the problematic parts of the law. I'm Phil Roberts, and I'm with the Human Rights Watch. Thanks, Leah, for organizing this. It's great to also that and my fellow speakers here. It's very important. I want to talk a little bit about the origins of this law as we understand it, and what some of the political aspects of it. Plus, I'll also mention a couple things about the actual provisions of law that we're very concerned about, and then some of the things that are being done in terms of advocacy to try to stop this. So, we understand that there was actually originally a Ministry of Social Development and Human Security draft law, which was brought up by a number of NGOs, sort of on the center right of the political spectrum, saying, we should have something that would encourage NGOs, and that NGOs could work with the government. And of course, the Ministry of Social Development and Human Security is the place where that kind of attitude does prevail, that they do have, relationships with service providers in the community of America. And that draft law was drafted, and actually it has also gone through this public comment process. Without going too deeply into law, it basically sets up a committee to promote NGOs and talks about how NGOs and government could work together. It originally was to have a fund that was going to be there, that the government was going to fund, that would then fund NGOs. And the idea was that if you were registered as an NGO, then you would be entitled to all these additional things and benefits in collaboration with the government and all these things like that. That fund was taken out, which raises a lot of questions about whether the law is just something to set up a committee. But anyways, this was something that was being worked on. And we understand that last year, around the time that this thing was being discussed, a bunch of the security agencies, particularly the National Intelligence Agency, the National Security Council, the Ministry of Interior, the Ministry of Defense, said, well, yeah, we should have an NGO law that we want to, and we want to have a law on the operations of NGOs. And so a second law was envisioned, which is the problematic one that we're now talking about, which is the law on operations. So it's important to recognize there are two different laws. One is, to be honest, quite frankly, benign, and one is very bad. We understand that the concerns of these security agencies are partly about a number of Thai NGOs, particularly ones that have been involved or supporting some of the protesters. So the Thai Lawyers for Human Rights, or I-Law, which of course drafted the version of the Constitution that the protesters were urging the Parliament to consider, and other human rights NGOs, are, to the extent that there's been this sort of rabble on the right, some of these sort of nutty ultra-conservative groups who are basically saying that, everything is being funded by foreigners. There's a grand conspiracy against Thailand. And so, part of this was also like, we want to control the NGOs, but we also want to control the foreign funding of NGOs. And they're moving this very quickly, as Kay mentioned. These things have been moving very quickly, and we understand that actually it's the law and the operation of NGOs, the bad law, that they really want to move through the process. And I think the Ministry of Social Development and Human Security thing is something they're not that concerned about. There is quite clearly a very problematic issue with having the Ministry of Interior oversee civil society, since the Ministry of Interior has consistently been the most hostile ministry towards NGOs operating in the country. It has a long history of antipathy towards people's movements and NGOs. There's a very, very broad definition which is being used. Now, this definition, the NGO is almost completely undefined, and I think part of this comes from places like Cambodia, where you know, in typical Thai government fashion, you know, they said that we went around and studied a bunch of different laws from other countries. So they were looking at Pakistan and India and Cambodia and Russia, I think the UK and France or a couple others, you know, so they can say that they looked at some of the Europeans as well. But the takeaway was that this Cambodia law, the law on NGOs, which was problematic and it was passed over a lot of opposition from NGOs in Cambodia, basically included everybody. Everyone's included. The big net. And so what that would mean here, and the way it's currently defined, is that, you know, a group of villagers who are protesting against a mine up in Loei, you know, they call themselves the group of villagers to protect this or protect that. They would be covered under this. You know, a group of people living with HIV/AIDS who basically come together to basically work with the community to make sure people are getting the retrovirals, they would be covered. People working on harm reduction, you know, needle exchanges, they'd be covered. You know, the local cannabis growers assembly, they would be covered. Everybody's going to be covered. And almost everybody we're talking about here is not registered. Okay. The number of groups that are actually formally registered as associations or foundations is quite small. Now, if you're registered as a foundation or as an association of this law that is being proposed, you would not have to register under this law, but this law would apply to you. So this is like the overarching act. And I just had an argument with an American NGO last night, and they were like, "Oh, we're not covered. We're registered on this and stuff like that." I said, "Just read what it says. It basically says you are covered. You just don't have to go through the registration process that's set out in this law." So, you know, it quite clearly is going to cover everybody. And the fact that they're moving this very quickly is shown in the really sort of rudimentary public participation process, where they literally, you know, have a draft of the law that, you know, they parked in some remote corner of the Office of Council of State's website and said you can submit opinions. I don't think they expected to get any opinions. In fact, they got opinions from ICJ, from us, from Amnesty, from International Center for Nonprofit Law, from Forum Asia, from Civicus, and a number of others. So there has been a significant number of comments made about this, which we'll see what the Council of State does. But you know, the public participation process was a joke, frankly. Let me just sort of pick out a couple of the really problematic issues in the law. You know, Kay covered a number of these, but I want to just add that, so in the provision, where it is, okay, one of the provisions, I mean, everybody has to register, of course, and you have to register under the criteria, methods, and conditions prescribed by the minister, which presumably come in some sort of ministerial regulation. But they've also said that organizations must act in compliance with the criteria, methods, and conditions prescribed by the minister. So, you know, it could be that the minister decides that one day he doesn't like ill-tried people, or he doesn't like gay people, or he doesn't like foreigners who talk about human rights, or he doesn't like Burmese migrant worker associations. You know, he could do whatever he wanted because this is the way it's set out here. The foreign funding issue, to fund only activities in the kingdom as permitted by the minister. So obviously this is causing a lot of consternation among some of the embassies and UN agencies who actually do fund local organizations and probably don't want to trundle down to the Ministry of Interior every time they have an idea to fund something. You know, the Ministry of Interior is probably the most opaque and least responsive of any of the ministries in the government. And so when you talk about, you know, a foreign funder having to check in with the Ministry of Interior, obviously they're not terribly thrilled about that. And I think the issue of the registration, which can be revoked, again, there's no real criteria for the revocation. And then, you know, it's sort of like pretrial detention. You know, you get it revoked, you can appeal perhaps somehow, although the appeal system doesn't exist now. There's no appeal to an administrator. There's no appeal to a board. Presumably there might be some sort of appeal to a court at some point. Maybe that will be added. But the way it's written right now is you are basically shut down while that appeal is going on. So, you know, just like somebody who's in pretrial detention waiting for a charge to be tried in the court, you could spend 3 or 4 years in pretrial detention before you're done. And then, of course, the punitive, clear, you know, they're basically criminalizing freedom of association. 5 years, 100,000 baht. Those are severe penalties for something like this. So I think that it is clear that a number of the security agencies within the Thai government have decided that they want to control the NGO movement, the nonprofit movement, both the Thais and the foreigners operating here. That they want to basically have stricter controls, and they want to ultimately be able to determine who can get money and who doesn't. And I will finally say that colleagues at Amnesty International, who went over and spoke about this with the Ministry of Labor, which currently oversees the registration process for foreign NGOs working here, were told, in fact, that as part of this process, they looked at what the situation was in India and what India had done to Amnesty International, which was basically run them out, and that they thought that was a great idea. So we'll be doing advocacy, obviously, with the various different embassies and the UN, and, you know, building awareness as much as possible. But I think it's also going to be, you know, this is all about building a very big coalition of people who are going to be affected by this. And part of that is what we're doing here today, which is spreading the word that this draconian rights abusing draft law is in process.
Thank you. Hi everyone, my name is Emily Palami-Praditi. I'm the founder and director of Anushaya Foundation. So we are a regional human rights, feminist, women-led organization based in Bangkok, and we work mainly with local communities and marginalized communities so they can be at the center of decision-making processes that concern them. When it came to this draft law, I was telling Kate that we did not submit comments. Why we did not submit comments? Because of the time frame. It was only 2 weeks. And the communities that we're working with are marginalized communities and local communities, which means that in order for them to be able to engage, we would need to basically spend 2 weeks with them on the ground, getting the input, explaining to them the challenges of the laws, what it would mean for them on the ground. Most of them are not registered, of course, and they are working at loose networks, grassroots-led communities network. So it's impossible for Thai local NGOs and Thai grassroots communities to engage in this process, to have their voices heard, because the time frame given to give input was too short. So at the end, obviously there will be comments submitted by NGOs, but those who need to be heard and who will be heavily impacted on the ground cannot engage. So that's very concerning for us, and we did not submit because we knew that anyways our colleagues would be submitting amazing comments analyzing the compliance of Thailand with international human rights standards. So I was asked to provide input on what would be the best NGO law possible, and actually there's no best NGO law, because in the perfect world you don't have NGO laws. We should be self-regulating ourselves, and our freedom of association is already enshrined in constitutions. So there are countries that have good examples of how they are operating and how NGOs are allowed to operate within the countries, and I will touch upon that. But first of all, I think it's important to remind that Thailand is a UN member state. So Thailand has obligations and international human rights obligations towards the international community. And Thailand is a party of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Under the Article 19 is our freedom of expression is enshrined, of course, and Article 22 is our freedom of association. And under Article 25 is our freedom to participate in public affairs. So obviously, most of the countries have to respect and to comply with this convention. And the current draft law on operations of the NGO is violating those articles. When it comes to restrictions, obviously our freedom of association is not an absolute human rights. It can be limited, it can be restricted. But in order for it to be restricted, it has to be necessary, proportionate, and it has to follow a legitimate goal. But in the case of Thailand, obviously there's no legitimate goal. We understand from what Kay and Phil said that really the goal of the Thai government is to crack down on civil society, not all NGOs, but clearly those that are vocal and those that are voicing the concerns about what is happening right now in Thailand, those who are supportive of the pro-democracy protesters, and those who are speaking out about human rights violations and denouncing the actions of the Thai government. And obviously concerned about the increasing use of lèse-majesté and 112. So it's clear that the Thai government is going after those organizations, those human rights organizations, and going after the funding of those organizations and trying to shape a narrative that is wrong. With this law, the Thai government is trying to shape a narrative that vocal NGOs are being funded by foreigners. It's an insult to youth, and it's an insult to Thai people who actually want democracy. You know, like nobody is putting democracy values in the mindset of young people. They are smart, they can think for their own. So I think what the Thai government is really doing is an insult to young people, is an insult to human rights activists and human rights defenders on the ground, and is also an insult to communities on the ground. When it comes to best practices of NGO laws, the best that you can have is what is right now happening in the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, you have freedom of association being enshrined in the Netherlands, in the Dutch constitution under its Article 8. So basically everyone can unite and associate, but you need to have a goal. So in the case of Thailand, in the case of the draft operation laws, the definition of civil society is very broad. Anyone who come together for non-profit purpose has to register. But in reality, when you're following international standards, you have to have a goal. So if you're a non-profit organization, it means that you are either serving the common good, you're operating for public benefits, for good governance, and you're also representing social groups or providing social services. In the case of Thailand, in this draft law, there's no precision on what is the goal of civil society. So the broad definition opens door to criminalization of activists on the ground, and of course open doors for control over what we do. And everyone will be considered civil society, as my colleague said. Also, I think what is also very concerning is that the Thai government is trying to control political activities. Because again, those that the Thai government is trying to go after are those who are vocal about the political situation right now. So those who are supportive of pro-democracy protesters and against the current Thai government. So what is happening in other countries when civil society are also engaged in political activities? So again, in the case of the Netherlands, you can also engage in political activities. There's no restriction on civil society. And in order to have a vibrant society, you need civil society, because we are the check and balance of people in power, and this is how you can also ensure democracy. In a country like Thailand, where the National Assembly does not reflect the true society of Thailand, since the Senate is appointed by the military and the elections were not that fair, you need civil society. You need people from the ground to be heard, you need people from the ground to be visible. So if civil society does not exist, you won't have proper check and balance. And what is the most concerning, I agree that this law is targeting, when I look at it, for me it's targeting NGOs, it's targeting regional NGOs that are operating in Thailand, it's targeting Thai human rights groups, but not only them, it's also targeting farmers and peasants who are standing up for their rights, who are protesting and who are going to jail because of unfair policy. And the fact that there's no precise definition, there's no precise criteria, and the only broad concept in these draft laws, it's really opening doors for anyone to be criminalized. And that's a common practice in Thai laws. If you look at different legislation, there's no precise definition. It's always in the name of national security. The fact that the Ministry of Interior will be the ministry overlooking the activity of NGOs is because Thailand does not apply a human rights lens when it comes to the work of civil society. Everybody has to comply with public order. Everybody has to comply with national security. The Thai government does not see civil society as serving the public good. So that's why it has to be controlled under the Ministry of Interior, because the Ministry of Interior is the ministry overseeing national security, the respect towards national security and public order. Thai foundations and Thai associations are already under the control of the Ministry of Interior. Some associations are under the Ministry of Culture. I mean, most HIV and LGBT organizations are registered or being overseen by the Ministry of Culture, but others are already being under the Ministry of Interior. When it comes to the Thai context, the Ministry of Labor is mainly looking at Thai NGOs and regional NGOs. So I would say for those who are already registered, we don't feel the pressure that we have to register, but as you said, we will also be looked upon by this new draft law and this new regulation. In an ideal democratic country, there's no NGO laws. We are self-regulated, and when it comes to our finances, we are accountable to our constituencies, and we are accountable to our board, our General Assembly. We're not accountable to the Thai government. We should not be accountable to the government about how we are spending our money. So in an ideal world, you don't have any NGO law. It's as simple as that, and you are regulated either through the constitution or the civil code. Right now in Thailand, foundation and association are regulated through the civil code. Yes, there are restrictions. We have to report back every year to the Ministry of Interior through a narrative report. We have to conduct audits. It's a burden for most NGOs, especially when you're very local NGOs, you don't have the capacity to do that. So obviously this new draft law on operations of NGOs is going to create a chilling effect. It's really to scare and create an environment of fear, and it's really to discourage advocacy and political activities of NGOs. They are hoping to silence us, and the fact that they can enter our offices and they can collect our electronic data is similar to the Computer Crime Act. It's similar to provisions that are in the Cybersecurity Act. It's similar to a lot of cyber laws that Thailand has already enacted. It's basically a crackdown on our digital space as well, on our freedom of expression, and it's very concerning. I don't know how the Council of State is going to reply to most of the comments, but in practice, and how the Thai government has always responded to NGOs submitting comments, is that these are coming from NGOs, and we want to hear from Thai organizations. So again, the draft law is already discriminatory. I mean, it's discriminatory towards regional organization and international organization. But in practice, the way that the Thai government has been operating and treating NGOs has already been discriminatory. Every time NGOs or regional NGOs have submitted comments, the Thai government has always said, thank you, but we want to hear from locals. We want to hear from Thai communities. But by giving only 2 weeks timeline for everyone to submit comments, obviously they won't be able to hear from local groups. So there's a will behind that from the Thai government, not giving enough space and enough time for local groups to be heard, for local groups to understand the challenges within the law, and for them to be able to submit complaints and comments. Obviously, we hope that UN agencies will play a role, but when you look at what UN agencies have been doing in neighbor countries, they haven't been, I don't want to say they have been useless. I'm sure they try their best, but the pressure has not been in favor of civil society. I mean, you look at what is happening in Cambodia, look at what is happening in Laos, there's no civic space at all. In Laos now, in order to be able to operate as an NGO, you need to ask the permission of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs if you want to hire an international consultant. You need to always seek approval from the Ministry of Interior to conduct activities. You need to do everything in partnership with the government. Every activity, the Ministry of Justice or the women unions has to come to your activity. So you don't have any freedom. And you won't be able to speak about human rights at all. In Laos, nobody talks about human rights. Everybody has to work through the SDGs. Looks like the Thai government is trying to do the same. forcing people to work through the SDGs and not working on the human rights agenda. So it's very worrying for us, and obviously we need to push back. But I think the best pushback that we can do is to voice our concerns that the time frame to submit comments was not appropriate for civil society to be able to submit comments. And if the Thai government really wants to hear from local groups about the draft law, then we need to hold press conferences, we need to push back, like we did in the past for the Thailand, to force the Thai government to allow more time for committees from the ground to give the input. And we need to pressure, obviously, the UN agencies to stop being complacent of governments, but to actually provide us with a space, provide us with a platform, and push back on the restrictive civic space. And obviously, embassies have an important role to play because it's their funding that we are talking about. It's their funding that is going to be restricted. If they cannot give to local communities, I don't know how Thai society can give back to local communities. If the Thai government wants organizations to only be supported by Thai people and not receive foreign funding, then it's impossible to have civil society in the country. Thailand being among one of the most unequal countries in the world, with 1% of the world wealth belonging to the richest of the country, knowing that 1% of those people are not supportive of monarchy reforms. So at the end of the day, it will be impossible for Thai grassroots and Thai NGOs to be funded only by Thai people. We need the foreign funding. So that's all for me. Thank you.
Sorry, we have a problem with Wi-Fi microphone, so we have to little bit not so practical. Okay, I open immediately the floor for 3 questions, and there is a microphone there. Please go there, or otherwise use a loud voice when questioning. Who wants to?
You're looking at me.
No, I know you always have some questions. So okay, so 1 for Debbie, other 2. No, then we start with Debbie first.
Okay. Actually, I was going to ask a question which is not really civil society related, but will companies doing funding community work, non-profit work, as part of their CSR, corporate social responsibility obligations, as well as companies forming alliances for social benefit? We have quite a few in Thailand. Will they be facing legal risk? Are they completely protected from this law, or does this law put them at legal risk?
The Council of State played an extremely active role in reviewing the government's draft law on legal recognition of same-sex relationships. I think it was extraordinary what they did. I do not know enough about the Council of State to predict what they might do to this civil society law. They might be very active. Do we have any clues as to what they might do?
Just to perhaps piggyback on Debbie's point, it seems as though the language is very strong on the activity that is not for profit. So, is it possible to engage modestly in for-profit activities in order to not be subject to this? And again, that's kind of the flip side of what Debbie was talking about.
Yeah, I will just answer. So some questions in the rest will be answered by the others. So indeed, when it comes to the restrictions on the type of activities, it is for the funding that they receive, that NGO receive from non-Thai person or entities. So if it one aspect is that if they got the funding from Thai business registered in Thailand, then I don't think the risk from the language of the law, the restriction on type of activity won't be applied to them. But anyway, they will still under the obligation to disclose the list of activities, the obligation to disclose the budget, of course. What could be difficult for them is that normally in Thailand registration won't take it won't be there forever. It will be there just 1 or 2 years. Like for if we are registered, then we have to re-register in every 2 years. So if they are not happy with your activities, if you work with corporate CSR and this kind of thing, if not happy with your activities, then during this re-registration process, there might be problems. And we don't know yet what will be conditioned in this re-registration process. We have to wait for Minister of Interior to decide on this. So that we might answer.
Thank you for the questions. Yeah, my understanding is exactly what she said in terms of companies. So if it's like, for instance, a European company that's trying to do something here, providing support to a nonprofit entity or agency, it could be a school board, it could be anything. They would also be covered. But the way it's done is the burden is placed on the NGO or the nonprofit to request permission from the minister. So what would happen is that say a village group is going to get some money from a company to plant trees. They'd have to be registered, and they would also have to go and get permission to receive that foreign funding from the Minister of Interior. So it's quite. Not only is it's just very burdensome and bureaucratic, and it's also very intrusive. In terms of the issue about the Council of State, the Council of State is really, to be honest, they're the legal drafters. They're operating based on instructions. So, they may have they may raise some issues, for instance, at one point or another. They will certainly be the ones that look at all the submissions that were made and say, okay, some of these things need to go in. So, I would expect that we might see a change where they would say, okay, we can't have a situation where the revocation doesn't have an appeal. They would create an administrative appeal, like, for instance, what happens with international NGOs. So, for instance, like when a year and a half ago when Amnesty had its registration renewal denied, they then appealed to the Minister of Labor. Under that regulations, his decision is final. But also, it took a number of months and things like that, and they were able to get enough pressure from diplomats and others that the Ministry of Labor people finally said, well, yeah, and there was a technicality found, of course, that the Ministry of Labor had not followed the proper procedure. So ultimately, the registration renewal denial was overturned. But the Ministry of Labor basically said, wow, we didn't know you had so many friends. And so what it really is there was a lot of political pressure applied, and it was explained to people that, particularly the Ministry of Labor, that it might look really bad if Amnesty International is being thrown out of the country by you guys. You understand that, right? So I think in terms of the Council of State, they will follow whatever political directions they get. Now, it may be that we have to talk to some of these other ministries, like the Ministry of Social Development and Security, saying like the Ministry of Public Health, saying all your volunteers and all these people that you work with are going to face huge problems if you do this. So maybe you need to talk to in the cabinet and say this is not just something you should leave to the Ministry of Interior to decide. And finally, I mean, on the issue of doing for-profit activities to evade application, well, I mean, obviously, I hope it doesn't come to that. But, you know, I mean, we might have to sell Human Rights Watch shirts.
Thank you for the questions. This question, you know, CSR is already very regulated, and we worked a lot on business and human rights, and that they need to hold companies accountable. So I think there's also possibility to maybe discuss with the ministries that are concerned about the TINAP to impose obligations on companies rather than NGOs. Like you want to give money to NGOs, knowing that the civic space is more restricted for NGOs, then you bear the responsibility to conduct those activities and to be responsible for those activities. Maybe that could be an avenue to remove the burden on us. When it comes to the Council of State, I have a different opinion. I think it also depends on the issue you are working on. So if you're working on an issue that the government wants to support, the Council of States will do its best to write the best legislation possible. But this draft operation laws is really to target groups that are vocal on human rights, but really on civil and political rights, and really supportive of pro-democracy protesters. For me, the last result I would see, if there's no dialogue possible, and if the Council of State is really drafting a very, very negative law, it would be to go to the Constitutional Court. That's what advocates and feminists have done for safe abortion in Thailand, to amend the penal code, to find a way to legalize abortion up to 12 weeks in Thailand. So they went through the Constitutional Court, and then in February 2020, the Constitutional Court considered the penal code article 305 unconstitutional because not allowing women to go through safe abortion. And then the Council of State had to draft new amendments. It was because of the Constitutional Court decision. So in the case of Thailand, if the draft operation laws on NGOs is very, very bad, that could be the last result that we could do, is to go through the Constitutional Court, and then the Council of State will have to comply with the court decision. When it comes to for-profit, to be honest with you, we start thinking about it, you know, because we work with a lot of local communities, and it's impossible for them to register, which means that even if they are doing activities with the new draft law, they will have to do the activities under the umbrella of Manushaya Foundation, which means that the responsibility then will be on me, or, you know, the responsibility is on the head of the organization. I will be the one who can be taken to court, who could go to jail. So it's a lot of responsibility, so we don't want to go through that. So what could we do to be able to disperse funding to local groups without being watched under this law? It's all NGOs, we are all experts in specific field, right? So we were thinking of, maybe we can open a consultancy branch. Maybe we can open a social enterprise, because we work with a lot of grassroots communities that produce rice in Isan, a lot of indigenous communities in Chiang Mai in the south that make jewelries, clothes. So you can open branches of like social enterprise, you can sell your consultancy services, especially to businesses, especially to also government agencies. They tend to invite us to speak for free all the time to inform the laws. This time they will have to pay us because you're passing this law that we cannot work. So pay us if you need our expertise. So I think there are ways, you know, to navigate, and we need to find those ways to navigate and be smarter than them.
May I add a little bit about the Council of the State issues? Indeed, I think they were working together from the beginning, the Cabinet and the Council of the State. We were trying to track down the letter between these two organizations when it comes to this law, and if they kind of, it's like a ping pong. Because indeed, the law that was submitted to the Cabinet was the law of the Ministry of the Social Development, the one that set up the committee that we was talking about. That one was, okay, set up a committee. That one was submitted. And then Cabinet sent a letter to Council of the State, like, can you comment on this law? And Council of the State comment like, oh, they are lacking many things. And then the Cabinet sent another letter back to them like, oh, so can you help write another law? And then the Council of the State write another law very fast within a couple of days, sent back to the Cabinet. And the Cabinet was like, yeah, I will make it a resolution. And then you work further on that. So it's kind of like a ping pong back and forth for a couple of weeks during that time, you know, and and then we see these draft operations, and that draft was being a bit forgotten. But at one point we were talking that they might combine these two drafts at one point to make it not so ugly, at least to have a committee, to promote the CSO in the law. So that's my comment.
Since Thailand is following Laos and Vietnam, where most of the NGO are for profit. But, okay. Yes, I was saying that Thailand is going to following on what she said, is going to follow the example of Vietnam and Laos, where actually most of the NGO are registered as business. But yes, I wanted to ask, I open again for the last round of 3 questions.
I was just going to say that Malaysia has a lot of the NGOs that are registered as companies as well. Because basically the registration process there with the Register of Societies and the Societies Act, it's been so politicized from the very beginning that if you were considered to be somehow human rights or labor or something, you would never get any sort of response from the registrar's office.
This is also true in Singapore.
Yeah. So I mean, unfortunately, ASEAN. I mean, what we get in ASEAN is we get all the bad ideas get traded around. I've always said that ASEAN meetings are like, kids getting flu at school. One has a bad idea, takes it to the group, and everybody gets sick.
No more questions? Otherwise, I ask some questions. Oh yes, other one. That's green.
Yeah, so you mentioned that now the consultation timeframe is very tight. So is that the possibility to extend that? Because you mentioned that you need to mobilize tight organizations. Because at the moment it's still, I saw it on Facebook, it's not many Thai organizations that come out to express their idea about that. And second, about the public opinion about that, is not that much debate around it. So what do you foresee in terms of the future? Because in this case, we may need some time for consultation, one, and the second for awareness raising. Yeah.
Well, it does. It's not always happened, but there was in the past there was a case where a lot of people came out and protest, say that they were not involved in the public consultation process, and before it's submitted to the parliament, they conduct another round of public consultations. That happened sometimes, but not always. Because in Thailand, when it comes to public consultations, they can make it super inclusive when they want. I was talking with Bill, the draft, anti-torture draft that we are waiting for more than a decade. When they did public consultation for the 3rd time or 4th time, I can't remember, I already lost count. They did public consultation in every region of Thailand. They did it in a hotel room, a ballroom, about a biggest room in the hotel, where like 100 people can be there and talk about the draft law. And before the public consultation, there will be academics who come and explain about what is pro and con, what will be the challenge of the draft law. That's happened when, especially for the law that they want to delay the process of enacting one law, then that's always happened. But then they want to make it fast, then this happened. So we hope that, if I remember correctly, with the Eastern Economic Corridor, back then, the act, there are people who protest about it, saying they were not consulted, and some organization tried to do some events on the ground later. We hope that now we are calling boss to the government, and we hope that they will do another round of consultation. That one was already done. Then we hope that they do another round of consultations. As Emily said, that the local group can participate. But we are worried because this law can pass very fast. After this, it will be sent back to the cabinet, and cabinet send it to the parliament. If it's a normal process, it can take around a month for the parliament as well to just pass a law, or even a bit faster if they want. And it will get even worse if the cabinet decide that this is law for reforming the countries. Under Thai constitution, if it's a law that reforming the countries, when it comes to the parliament, they will combine between Senate and representative house, the House of Senate and House of Representatives together, and then you do just one voting, of these people. So if all the Senate support this law, you just need 100 something representative to support them, then this law can be passed. I mean that it doesn't mean this might come. We have to see what the cabinet will say about this law. But if they think it's the law to reform the countries, if they categorize them as the law to reform the countries, then it might be even faster than we thought. I mean, so meant that we have less chance to challenge it. I mean, even with the opposition country don't want this law, it doesn't mean that they will be successfully able to challenge it. Even the whole opposition's representative would vote no.
So in what extent that the law could be interpreted in the way that is reform the country? I think this is a question we need to really brainstorming, because, for example, I'm the one of the movement to promote LGBTIQ rights, for example, and the civil court partnership law, or even like to reform civil court partnership for marriage equality, they would be considered as like, it's the urgent, even it's against for people to exhibit their family, right? In this extent also, I think if we could brainstorm and bring sorts of like concrete principle to say that it is not about that kind of issue, to prevent that the parliamentarian could join hands. That would be a possibility to prohibit this.
No, exactly, because it's crazy, because the power is with the cabinet to decide that it's law to reform the country or not. And when it should be, it wasn't. One channel that is possible is that if we have a member of the House of Representatives, 1/5 of them, to challenge it with the president of the parliament. But the president of the parliament will be the one who decides. But we can be prepared for reasoning. When the time comes, then we might try to, probably have to work with the parliamentary members to challenge and stop.
Okay, I think that we have some comments on Facebook. Edward, can you?
Yes, okay.
read it? I have one from someone from the European Union, and is saying that even member states that just promote research and cooperation are even worried about this law. So not so much the political one, but the one, let's say, that promotes research or academic research or other kind of cooperation. They are also concerned because some of those, of course, involve non-for-profit activities and organization.
And I would like to pass a question from our online audience from Lisa Broughton. And the question is, does this law affect small media? Could they be considered NGO under this draft, like small community radio?
Well, Prashata is registered as a foundation, I think, no? Yeah, they are media that are registered as Thai foundation, so obviously they are being targeted. And the Islam record as well now, so it's most of the most vocal independent media are registered as foundation, so they are being targeted obviously by this law. I just wanted to add a little bit to what people were saying about the time frame and how we can push back. I think there was only 2 weeks, so it's already closed, and I think the issue that we face is that nobody took the lead to gather local voices. You see, like nobody took the lead to inform grassroots and to tell them, okay, we need to meet, we need to gather, there's this important draft operation laws on NGOs that is going to be problematic for everyone. So nobody took the lead to do that, so that's why there was no input possible and there was no gathering, mobilization yet. But I think it's still possible to do it, and we still have to do it anyways. So it still needs to happen, and everything happened too fast for us to be able to gather. Yeah, it's bad timing, yeah. Songkran is coming, but everything obviously is done on purpose by the Thai government. They are very smart when it comes to crackdown and strategies to not give time to people. But the Thai government also wants to look good at the UN, so I think that's something that we also need to take into consideration, that the Thai government are always, the UPR is coming up, the Thai government is always want to look good at the UN, the Universal Periodic Review can be an avenue for us to push back, but it's still a long time to go, it's still in November. But yeah, again, I think we need to mobilize and push back to have more time, to have another round of consultation.
If I may ask, I mean, I think already was said a little bit, but I would be interested to really have a comparison of what we need to do now as a foundation. Being a foundation, we are also under the Ministry of Interior, actually, and Ministry of Education. So when you say the Ministry of Interior is bad, then we say, oh well, but we are still, even now, under the ministry. So it would be very important, I think, to have kind of a table, what is now and what would be the change exactly, because otherwise we may, foundation or not-for-profit may kind of say, well, after all, it's not such a big change. We still have to give our audit every year. Right? We have to send to the various ministry, we have to send to the neighborhood office, so we have always to see how much money we get. If they want to ask from where, they have the right to do so. So in a sense, it depends, we still depends on the goodwill of the Thai government even now. But what is that become worse with this new law? I think this needs to be very clear. Otherwise, so I would like to know for us, but I suppose many would like to know really, in what sense is a very bad change, or more or less we are already under control.
I mean, my view about this is that we can still stop this draft law. I think that it's very possible that we can get enough international attention and national movement attention to do this. I think that anybody who actually looks at this law will realize that this is completely a disaster. So, I mean, part of our effort really has to be is educate as many people as quickly as we can and get the information out to different groups and NGOs and people, you know, associations, that you will be affected. You will be hit by this if it goes through in its current form. And your life will not be better. Your life will be worse as a result of this. I mean, you know, we're going to work on trying to also get more media attention on this, what it means. I mean, my view about this is if it passes in its current form, this is NGO Armageddon. You know, we will see significant parts of the Thai NGO movement and some of the international NGO movement that are supporting them wiped out. So we can't allow that to happen. It's a fight for survival.
For this reason, I think it's important to understand in what way is worse than what we have. Make it clear to all of us, make it clear to all the organization, so that we will move, right? I mean, being a Thai foundation also, we are very concerned about this. Fully agree with you that we have, but I think it's important to understand the details on it.
So Manusha is registered as a Thai foundation. Obviously, why did we register as a Thai foundation? We opened after the coup d'etat. We opened in 2017. We knew back then already that there were a lot of NGOs and regional NGOs under the radar of the Thai government because they were vocal against the coup. And so our strategy was to register as a Thai foundation, so we wouldn't have to go through all the headaches that regional NGOs had to go through the Ministry of Labor, having to have your registration being approved every year. Once you're registered as a Thai foundation, you're registered one time, and that's it. So, like you know, like we have to go through audit, we have to submit a narrative report, and that's it. We have never been controlled. Nobody came to our office. So, I would say we if we were not vocal about the pro-democracy protest, I wouldn't have been that worried. I would have thought, okay, we are working mainly with local communities, we're empowering them, providing them with the knowledge, doing a lot of legal empowerment training so they can fight back for their rights. But we were not vocal about the pro-democracy protest, so we are not going to be monitored or watched after. I think really the first target would be the ones that are vocal, would be the ones that are supportive of the pro-democracy protest, would be the ones that are vocal about lèse-majesté, the Computer Crime Act, about the weaponization of the emergency decrees and all the cyber laws and all the actions that the Thai government are doing against human rights defenders and pro-democracy activists. They will be the first round of organizations that the government is going to look after. Who are the ones that are not being registered? Who are the ones that need to be registered? Who are the ones that need to be controlled? Who are the ones that are going to go and inspect the offices and ask for the financial audit, look into the computers? I think those will be the first targeted. And I think for those who are doing activities that are not controversial for the Thai government, that do not bother the Thai government, I think it would be a secondary, for my opinion, and that's my personal opinion, for me it would be a secondary worry. I think the first people who should worry really are the ones that are supportive of the pro-democracy protest and those that are denouncing police violence and are denouncing the abuses from the Thai government and the violation of international human rights standards. Those are the first ones that should be worried. When it comes to international funding, you will see the Thai government, there's no criteria right now on international funding, but you will see, depending on the issue you're working on, some international funding will be very welcome. If you're working on specific women's rights, or if you will be working on LGBT rights, or if you'll be working on HIV services, international funding will be welcome. If you're providing HIV services to communities on the ground, the Thai government needs money from the Global Fund. The Thai government needs money from USAID and all those international development agencies to fund HIV services in Thailand. So those international funding, those foreign funding will be welcomed. So again, I think for me it's really a question of the issues you're working on. And those who are the most vocal and working on civil political rights will be the first ones to be targeted by this law.
Just want to add about the key difference. The first key difference would be that all informal gatherings or associations have to be registered. And that the first one, otherwise you can be subject to criminal punishment. The second key difference would be that you might have to wait for the approval for you spending your fund that you got from non-Thai entities. This approval process, we don't know yet. How it looks like, how long it will take, how they will make it, there's no idea. The third one is that now many NGOs in Thailand have that kind of experience that we got some warning from the authorities when they do something that they feel like, it's already still up to burn. I mean, there's already sensitive issues. It could be a verbal warning, it could be a written warning or this kind of thing for the Thai government. But now, this warning is not just warning that we can negotiate and say, this is our duty. In the past, we can negotiate. But now this warning will come with criminal punishment, it will come with the court warrant. That means we don't have the rooms now to negotiate with them about the activities we can't do. But we probably have to negotiate with them in the courtroom. Another thing is that if they don't now, if you already step on the boundaries of the activities that the government seems sensitive, it is when the government found that you do something from the media. But with this law, they don't have to wait for the media to report about this or you to push them up to your social media, but they can go to your office and look around. And if they find something, then again, you probably have to talk with them in the courtroom that you're doing activities that was not approved or the approval couldn't extend to these activities, this kind. So that would be a key difference in my opinion.
So very crucial difference, especially if we need to ask permission every time we want to spend some money. That would mean we cannot do anything basically.
I would also add, since there's a maximum amount of discretion provided to the Minister of Interior, and the Ministry of Interior is such a very conservative ministry, that it won't be necessarily also just about activities you're doing in the human rights, but they may also have very clear ideas about what they think is proper Thai activities versus activities that they seem is somehow undermining social values or cultural values, or they say the peace and good order of Thailand. And this is a code word that is often used to sort of marginalize certain groups of people. And I would expect that we would also see that kind of thing coming from the Ministry of Interior. That there are certain groups of people that they don't want to have necessarily in power. Could be ethnic minorities. Could be related to Soji. It could be related to people who are involved, with drugs, and basically are involved in harm reduction. These are people that the Ministry of Interior views as being unwelcome, unhelpful to have in society. And I would expect that we would see some of these things come on those people. So there'd be a degree of victimization based on bias and discriminatory views within the Ministry of Interior. But we also, religion as well could also come in.
Any last comments?
Are you pressed enough?
We have lost our tongue. I think we are convinced that it's very serious and that we need to do more. We could do an event in Thai, probably to start with, rather than only in English. That probably would be on our side. Something that we can do, and material in Thai language probably also help. Maybe it's already available. If so, you could share.
There is various materials. There's the draft laws in Thai. People want these things. Let us know, and we can send them to them. So just come up and give me your email. We'll send them to you.
Comment to the law. I have seen in English.
There's some like ICJ were very diligent and got translated into
very
Thai.
impressive.
Yeah. So there are certainly the comments that were submitted. We're going to translate ours to them. Yeah. So yes, there are materials in Thai that we can certainly use, that we can have available. But I think it would be great to have another event in Thai.
Okay, so we can plan for after Songkran. And if you, of course, can do or need documents or you have suggestion about to further disseminate this information, please do, or we can coordinate also. Thank you for coming, and please, on your way out, the next event of Junction is actually about Burma, but it's going to be only on Zoom. It's a bi-weekly update on what is happening in Burma in collaboration with Irrawaddy. So please, on the 8th of April at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, you can connect with Zoom or on Facebook Live. And for the rest, we are also going to have some vacation for Songkran and then come back again with other events. Please give a donation on your way out, as this supports civil society. On the issue of money, it's very interesting that the government is preoccupied about foreign funding for NGO, but they also take money from other countries, and nobody seems to question that practice. And the same for private sector, is investors come from other countries, but again, no one seems to worry about that kind of influence. So maybe we need to deconstruct also that kind of language about foreign money to whom, because I'm sure civil society don't get as much money as the private sector in this country, foreign investor. With that wise word, thank you for coming, and there is some coffee and tea outside to continue the discussion. Thank you very much.